little town on the Austrian border, and we had to meet the smuggler in one of the sort of a restaurant and inn. And when we got there, there was already another Jewish couple, a young couple, with a baby on their arms, who were also waiting for the smuggler. And he told us when he came, first he collected his fee, which was considerable, and then he told us that he was gonna pick us up the next morning and take us across. So by the next morning, what he actually had done was he had paid off some Swiss border guards, and he took us to an Austrian swimming pool, which was also being used by Swiss sometimes. And the Swiss used to drive across the border and go to the swimming pool. And what they did is he just called for Swiss taxis to come and pick us up. And then they just drove us across the border, and the border guards saluted the taxis, and we were in Switzerland. The only problem was that we were now right smack on the Swiss border. And we knew from experience that if you were caught on the border, you were immediately shipped across. That if you got in the interior of the country, you stood a better chance of surviving than if you were caught on the border. So the lucky thing was that this couple with the baby had made arrangements with someone in Switzerland to wait for them on the Swiss side of the border. And this man had a car, and he was going to transport this family with a baby into Zurich. But when he saw us, he said that he didn't have room for us in the car, and that did we have money to get on a train and to go to Zurich, because we couldn't stay on the border. And we didn't. So he paid the fare for us, and we got on the train, and he said he was going to get to Zurich before we did, and he would receive us, and he would wait for us in the Zurich railroad station and pick us up and take us to his place, and which is what he did. So that sort of saved us from being caught right on the borderline, border there, you see. When after we were with him overnight, we had to go and register with the police, and they interrogated us about where we crossed and why we crossed and all these kind of details. And again, I possibly made the mistake in not telling them that the point where we had crossed, because I felt that other people might want to use the same route, and if I told the police, they'd be closing. So as a result, it's possible that the police was not very happy with my not being cooperative with them.
What was the Swiss policy at that time towards Jews?
Well, the Swiss had just about at that time when I crossed, had possibly some 2,000 or 3,000 Jewish refugees in Switzerland. And in fact, I found out later, I crossed on the 10th of August, and on the 18th of August, they closed the border totally. In other words, they told the Jewish committees in Vienna and so forth that anybody crossing after that date would be sent back.
What was the year?
I beg your pardon?
What was the year that happened?
That was 1938. It was 1938.
So it's still in the same year.
In fact, the Swiss police chief at that time made a strong suggestion to the Germans that they ought to put a J for Jew into passports, Jewish passports, because his people on the border were having difficulty discriminating between the Germans and the Jews. And as you probably know, the Germans welcomed this suggestion, and as a result, after that, all the German Jews or Austrian Jews had a big J for Jew in the passport. And it made it very easy, very simple for all the countries, surrounding countries, if they wanted to keep the Jews out, to do so, because everybody was a marked.
Well, who supported you at that time, and what did you do with your time when you were there?
Well, when they gave me 3 months permission to stay, it was with the understanding that I was not to take any employment. And as a result, I was being supported by a Jewish committee in Switzerland. They were very nice to us, and we didn't live a great life, but we had the necessities, and I roomed with a friend, the fellow that came across the border with me. We shared a room together, and actually it was sad, because here we were, you know, I was 17 years old. I was, in fact, the youngest refugee, Jewish refugee in Switzerland that didn't come with family. And here we were in this foreign country with no family, with no friends, no way of making a living, no way of going to school, no future, nothing, you know. The picture looked very, very dim, and I was very depressed. In fact, as I said, I got only a 3 months permission to stay first, and then I had to apply before the 3 months were up. I had to apply for another 3 months, and when they gave me the second 3 months permission to stay, they stated in the letter that this was the final extension I was getting. That, in other words, I wasn't going to get any more time in Switzerland. For me, this was a terrible time, because I was already, Switzerland only has that many borders and that many countries adjacent to it. One of the big countries adjoining it is France. And I had already been kicked out of France. My passport already showed that I wasn't supposed to be coming back there, you see. So the only place left was Italy, you see. And basically what the Swiss police would do, that if they found you on the day after your time is up, they would ask you which border you want to be sent across, and they would simply take you to the border and put you across and let you wonder what you're going to do and what's going to happen to you. So for me, the only border there that was left was Italy, you see. And you probably know that Mussolini at the time was a good friend of Hitler's, and things weren't that good there either, you see, for the Jews. So I was very, very depressed, and I had thoughts of committing suicide. And what happened was that I was once sitting in a cafeteria where a lot of the refugees used to meet, and I was telling some of the other people the fix that I was in, you know, that all of a sudden I really had only so many months to go and didn't know what I was going to do. There were, at the adjacent table, some young fellows, some Swiss Jewish fellows, who came out of very good, rich homes, who had overheard my story, and who later came over to me and told me that they wanted to help, that they wanted to see what they could do, if there was anything they could do. And in fact, what they did do, they found out that if they enrolled me in a school in London, a language school, and paid tuition for a year, the British would probably give me a visa to go and study English. And this is what happened. I did get a visa from the British as a student going to London. And in fact, I had to go, in order to get my visa, I had to get a German passport, because the Austrian passport no longer was in existence. And when I went to the Germans, I must have looked pretty Aryan to them because they issued me a German passport without a J, you know. And now I had a good, beautiful Aryan passport with a British visa in it, and I was on top of the world. Except that the people that had befriended me, you know, these Jewish Swiss people, said to me that they thought that I ought to go back to the German consulate and ask them to put the J back in there again, you know, put the J in. And their reasoning was that things looked very, very critical at the time. War could break out any minute, and that if I was caught with a German passport as a good old German in England, I would probably be interned. Whereas if I get caught in England with a Jewish passport, I would be all right. So I went back to the German consulate, and they couldn't believe what they were hearing. I mean, they didn't believe that somebody would come back to them and say, would you please put in the J, which is what they did. So this brings us to about February of 1939, which is when I went to London.
And then what did you do once you arrived there?
Well, in London, the climate wasn't much different in the sense that I got permission to stay, and theoretically I was supposed to be studying languages, and we weren't supposed to work. So I was being supported there too by the Jewish Committee, except in this case I actually worked for them. I did clerical work for the committee there, and I was in London about a little over a year. War started in September of 1939, and about March or April of the next year, I was able to get a U.S. visa.
Let me ask you, did you have any communication at all with your family during any of this time?
Yes, in fact, I was the one that communicated with my parents not only about my well-being, but also about the well-being of my brother Eddie, who went to Czechoslovakia, because we had made up that we knew that the mail was being censored and read by the Nazis, and we gave my brother the pseudonym Uncle Moritz, and I used to report on his well-being in my letters, because he never directly communicated with his parents, you see. So that I used to write and tell them that I'd heard from Eddie, that he was all right, and so forth, you see. So we kept in touch in that way.
What was happening with your parents?
Well, their letters were very short and very cryptic. You had to read between the lines as to what really was happening and what they were doing. Apparently, my father was being worked to death. You know, in other words, he was in some kind of a slave labor factory or something. I never could get the details. He never felt courageous enough to write about it. All he would say always is that he's very tired, that he works long hours and many days and so forth. It wasn't until after the war that I really found out how bad conditions were, you know, that they worked 6-day weeks and worked long hours every day, got the very minimum of food stamps, were not allowed to use a streetcar, you know, to go to and from work unless the workstation was more than 3 miles away from where they lived. So conditions were very, very bad.
Okay, getting back to when you were in England, how long were you actually in England?
Well, I was in England from February 1939 to May of 1940.
Okay.
So I was in England already when the war started between Germany and France and England, which was in September '39. When I left England to go to the United States in May, we were in a convoy. We left Southampton on late at night. Nobody knew when the ships were going to leave, and the next morning when we got up, there must have been about 30, 40 ships all around us, and they were all going the same direction towards the United States. And we had warships that were circling the whole group, you see. And there were scares, submarine scares, every so often, that they sighted submarines, and so they had to detour. And we didn't arrive in, we were supposed to arrive in New York, and instead we pulled into Boston Harbor because we ran out of fresh food and water and things like that. We were on the boat probably about close to 3 weeks, you see.
How did you, how were you able to get to the United States? I mean, did you just need to get a visa or a passport, or what were the circumstances around that?
No, it wasn't nothing as simple as that, actually. At that time, the immigration rules were that you could only come to the United States if there was someone in the United States that was willing to send you an affidavit stating that he would take care of you, that you would never become a public charge, and that he was in good enough financial circumstances so that he could take care of you. And in addition to that, if you had this affidavit, at that time, there were quotas. Every country had a certain number of quotas, a certain number of visas assigned to them. And every year, once that quota was met, you had to wait for the next quota. And everybody that applied for a visa got a number and had to wait his turn. Now, it so happened that the quotas for Russia, Poland, and so forth were very, very small and were exhausted very fast, which meant that my parents, who came from Poland, even though they had an affidavit, never stood a chance to leave for the United States. I, on the other hand, was born in Vienna, Austria. I came out of an Austrian quota, and that quota was larger and wasn't as much drawn on. So when I was in London, my number, in a sense, my number came up, you see. And that's when I left.
Where did you go next?
Well, when we landed in Boston, I took a bus up to New York City, where I had some very distant relatives, but they couldn't really support me in any way because they were in dire straits themselves. Times were really tough. There was a big depression on at the time, and it was very hard to get any kind of job in New York City. I didn't want to become a burden to my sponsor, the one that had given me the affidavit, because the understanding was that he was doing it as a formality and that I really wasn't going to call on him for any monetary needs. So then my aunt in California, my aunt who had just come over about a year earlier from Vienna, was living in California at the time, and we arranged for me to go and stay with her. I had a hard time there too because things weren't that much better in LA, but I eventually did find a job, and I had a job as a salesman in a technical bookstore. And then the war started, you see, and everybody who was not a U.S. citizen had to register as an alien. And when I went to register, they asked me, where were you born? And I said I was born in Vienna, Austria. And the lady who was writing, filling in the form was saying, well, there's no more Austria, so you were really born in Vienna, Germany. So I said, well, I guess that's correct. So as a result of this little interchange, I automatically became enemy alien, because according to them, I was the German. And being an enemy alien in California at the time, you had strict rules as to what you could or couldn't do. You could not go near any harbor installations. You couldn't go near the water, the ocean. You had to be restricted to a curfew at night. I don't remember whether it was 9 or 10 o'clock at night. You had to be in your house. And a few other such restrictions existed. And but despite the fact that I was now an enemy alien, when my number came up for registration with the United States Army, I got a letter from Roosevelt, President Roosevelt, saying greetings, and I was inducted in the Army. And it wasn't until I was in the Army for quite a while that I got a notification from the Immigration Department saying that I'm no longer an enemy alien, you see.
What month and year was that when you went into the Army, and how old were you?
Well, I was, let's see, I was inducted in the Army in 1943. And 1943, I was 22 years old. And when I joined the Army, they had a program at the time where people that had a certain level of intelligence test score were sent to some universities that were set up by the Army, either for engineering studies or for language studies or for medical school studies. In my case, they decided that I should be studying engineering. So they sent me, after 3 months of basic training, they sent me to Princeton University to take engineering courses. And while I was at Princeton, I had been in the Army 90 days or more, and as a result, I was eligible to become a U.S. citizen. And so that at that point, I was taken down to the U.S. District Court in Trenton, and I was sworn in as a U.S. citizen. The interesting thing about it is that I was told before going down there that it would be a very simple matter at this point if I wanted to change my name, anglicize it, or this was the time to do it because it wouldn't entail too much red tape. So I decided after some consideration that maybe I ought to change my name. And as a result, Leopold Weisberg became Gary L. Wells.
What was the reason you decided to change your name?
Well, I had, at the time, I had a girlfriend in New York. And you must remember, I was really a greenhorn. I mean, I hadn't been in the country very long. So I didn't really know what I should or shouldn't do. And she felt that if I was going to go seriously into engineering, in order to be able to make a career in engineering at the time, there weren't too many Jews in this field, and it wouldn't hurt if I changed my name. And so I decided to do that.